Hi, so I thought I'd take a moment and go through how to set up a basic VPN using PPTP. Essentially, it's this layout right here. So you can see your read-write DC01 is used as the internal DC/DNS and a DHCP server. I've connected that to an internal switch in ESX. That interface is connected to an internal switch, and this has a static IP. And that static IP is 192.168.0.10/24. And we have a remote access server. Two interfaces on the remote access server. Internal is 192.168.0.1, and external is statically set at 10.152.70.114. Okay, so that has one interface plugged into the inside, one to the out, and on the external switch, which is the MBCC network, I have a Windows client, my Windows 7 client. It's joined to the domain, and it's just set to DHCP client. So this is the layout for your ESX infrastructure. Two servers running server 2012 R2 standard, one of them with two interfaces that is a domain member, and your Windows 7 or Windows 8 client on the outside of the network. Okay, so just to show you the ESX settings, this is the RWDC01. Go to Edit Settings. There's one network adapter that's actually in use. It says it's connected, and it's connected to the Shane Somerville internal switch. This other network adapter I had before, I left it disconnected. So I'm only using one interface, and it's the internal. If I take a look at the remote access server, Edit Settings, it has a network adapter connected to the external network and one on the internal network that is connected. And the Windows 7 machine, Edit Settings, one interface on the external network. So the first thing to do is set up the topology, just like the plan. Make sure all your interfaces are connected properly, and then to go in and set them up. So inside of the server, before you get started at all, you want to go to the adapter settings, and you can see I've renamed one external NIC and one internal NIC. So it's going to be hard to know which one is which if you don't rename them. So the way I did it is that I selected one and I went into the settings for it and say I want to know which one is the internal adapter. I could disconnect one of them. Right? So the one that's left connected is on the external switch. I go in here, and you can see the one that's left connected is on the external switch. So I renamed it external, and then I plugged the other one back in once I knew which one was which for sure. The last thing you want to do is continue on in the lab and then realize that you've got the wrong adapter plugged in, or they're backwards. Nothing's going to work if they're backwards, right? So you have them plugged in. You need, where'd that go? There we go. It was weird. So you need the IP settings. So properties here. This is the external adapter. I have 10.152.70.114. Right? I've picked one of my static IPs that I can use. I put in the default gateway, and I'm using the college's DNS. Okay. So this can connect me to the internet. I can access the internet on this adapter. If I look at the other one, the internal adapter, properties, TCP/IP, I have 192.168.0.1, the first interface, or the first IP address in the internal subnet, and a mask, and I don't have a default gateway set. Default gateway is your gateway of last resort when you don't know where to send traffic. There is no way to reach any other networks if you send traffic on the internal network. There is only one subnet. So there's only, the default gateway should be on the external adapter because that's where you can actually reach other networks. So you leave this one blank. preferred DNS I've got pointed to myself. I'm actually running DNS on this server. In a previous lab, we set up 2 DNS servers and we changed these settings, and it's fine. You can leave it at that. If you haven't done the DNS labs and you're not running DNS on this server, then it should be pointing to the DNS server, the RWDC01. Okay. So those are the IP settings on that server. If I took a look at the RWDC01, you may have it set up with 2 interfaces. I would recommend that you unplug the external adapter. So you do the same thing, unplug one, check to see that it's external, and leave the internal adapter connected. And then you can pick an address for that internal adapter. So I picked 192.168.0.10, and I pointed to the gateway, 192.168.0.1. Right? Just like our diagram. This is the RWDC01, and I've got 10 as the address, and default gateway is pointed to 192.168.0.1, so I can exit through the internal interface of this remote access server. Okay, so that's good. Gives me a multiple gateway warning, but this is unplugged anyway. And again, the Windows 7 machine is set to dynamic. So DHCP, yes, I have a 10.152 address on the external DHCP server. Okay, so at this point you should have connectivity between the 2 internal machines and from the internal machine, or between these 2 and from the external interface and your Windows 7 machine. Basic ping between these just to check for connectivity, and then you could begin setting up routing remote access. So to set up routing remote access, I go to the remote access server. Once I have the interface set up, it's under Add Roles and Features, and you can go in here. And out of the list, you'll see there's network policy and access, and there's remote access. So network policy server, that's to set up time of day restrictions and additional settings for network access protection. But we're just going to start with remote access. You just select that one box, click Next, accept the features that it's going to install. And just to get it set up for a remote access server, to start, we just want direct access and VPN. And we're not going to set up remote access today, it'll just be the VPN for point-to-point tunneling protocol. So I start that installation and we wait until it's done. Okay, so now the remote access server is done installing. I'll just hit close. And it'll bring up a message here. It says post-deployment configuration. Open the Getting Started wizard. Click on that. And then you have to wait. It gives you some options for the Getting Started wizard. Deploy both direct access and VPN. Direct access only or VPN only. We just want the VPN only to start. Okay, it takes you to the routing remote access console. And you'll notice that there's nothing done. It's turned off. There's no configuration. Nothing's set up at this point. It just takes you to the remote access console. So the first thing you need to do is configure and enable routing remote access. So you're given some options for configuration. You can have remote access, dial-up, and VPN. You can configure the remote access server for network address translation. You can have VPN and NAT, or a secure connection between 2 private networks. This is a demand dial VPN. If you want to go over the internet and have an endpoint that's 2 remote access servers, or you can do a custom configuration. There's different ways to do this. I'm going to go through, I'll pick this one, VPN and NAT. So this will allow remote access connections and hopefully external or internal to external network address translation as well. So the VPN connection. To enable VPN clients to connect to the server, at least one network interface must be connected to the internet. So this is where it's really helpful to have the interfaces renamed So external NIC is the one that's connected to the internet. I'll just select that interface. How do I want to assign addresses to clients? You can see I have automatic or from a range. We have a DHCP server. In previous labs we set up the DHCP server already. If you let's just take a moment because I want to use DHCP. I go back to, this is the DHCP server, it's the RWDC01, it's written up here, and tools and DHCP. So if you haven't already done this, you want to take a moment and set up the DHCP scope. Okay, so the DHCP console is opened up. Okay, so you can see here I had the 10.152.70 scope from before. That was when I had this machine connected to the external network. And we had DHCP, and we used this for previous labs with a filter and whatnot. So I just right-clicked and I deactivated it. So I don't need it. I don't have an address in that range anymore. If I take a look at the bindings, I actually have 192.168.0.10 is the only binding that I have. So I'm only going to give out addresses in this range. So I had to create a new scope. It's in the 192.168, and the address pool goes from 100 to 140. And you can see I have an address lease out to the Windows 7 client already. There's no reservations. For scope options, I'm giving 192.168.0.1 being the internal address of the remote access server. 10 is myself, that's the DNS server, and the DNS domain name is my domain name. No policies, and I have filtering disabled. If you have filtering enabled from the previous exercises where you have a MAC address and you have filtering, then it will actually prevent giving out an address from this pool, right? You need to be able to give a set of 10 addresses from the DHCP server to the remote access server. So it's important to go in here and disable the allow filter. And you don't need to worry about giving out addresses to the external network because we're on an internal switch, so there's no way that anything's going to happen. And everybody in the class could actually use 192.168.0, the same set of addresses as I've used because we're all separated on internal switches. Okay, so that's set up. The other thing you might want to do before you continue is to check under DNS. If you've changed your static IP settings, you want to make sure that your domain in DNS updates properly with the new IP. Okay, so it can cause problems for authentication if your IP settings are incorrect in DNS. Just go in here, make sure it's listed. If it's not, you can run ipconfig/register DNS. You could also restart the net logon service or restart the server. And that's it for that. So if you have the DHCP scope created, you go back over to the remote access server and you can select automatic assignment through DHCP. Then for managing multiple remote access servers, so if you have more than one remote access server, you would want to send the policy request back to a RADIUS server. We don't. We only have one remote access server we're setting up, so we'll use routing remote access to authenticate connection requests. Hit finish. And it gives you a message to support relaying of DHCP messages from remote access clients. You must configure the properties of the DHCP relay agent with the IP address of the DHCP server. That would only be true if this DHCP server was sitting someplace else in the network behind some other router where you had to pass the request through the router to reach the DHCP server. If that was the case, then you would have to use a DHCP relay agent with the IP address of the DHCP server. That's not our scenario. We don't have a router behind here. We're all in the same broadcast domain, we're on the same subnet, we're just plugged into an internal switch. So when a client makes a request to this remote access server, it will be able to grab addresses from the DHCP server locally without the need for a relay agent. You just wait for that to finish. Okay, so the remote access server is nearly set up. We can test a remote access connection from a client, but at this point there's one thing left to configure. So let's just go ahead and try it. So let's say we come back here and we need to create the connection for the VPN. Okay, so we'll have to create a connection for the VPN. So we can click on the set up a new connection or network. And we want to connect to a workplace and use my VPN. So the address we had figured out before. It's this external address of our router, 10.152.70.114. So in the real world, you'd want to register a name and tell your clients to use that. But for here, we'll just put that in. We don't have a CA set up or smart cards, so we can't use that. And there's a checkbox to allow other people to use this connection. And if you check this box, then it actually allows the employees to log into the VPN before they authenticate to Windows. So it's a nice feature. And I want to test the connection now. Put in my administrator password. I can spell. My domain is coffee. I like coffee. And I'll connect. And it tries to connect using SSTP first, and it'll come down through for the weaker technologies. This should fail. I don't know, there's one thing left to do, and it says connection was prevented because of a policy configured on the RRAS VPN, specifically the authentication method. Username and password may not match. Please contact the administrator. So let's go back. Okay, so on the remote access server, there has to be a policy to let you connect. Or I go over to the Active Directory domain controller. Where's my Active Directory users and computers? Let's take a look here. The administrator, properties, there's a dial-in tab. And you can see for network access permission, you can allow, deny, or control access through remote access policy or through network policy service. So this is the default, control access through the MPS network policy. I could click allow and apply this and go back over to the VPN client, and I'll try that again. And wait. Okay, and it says I am connected now. So just by clicking allow, it lets me in. But the default is to use the MPS policy. So I'll disconnect this guy and go back. Set it to the defaults. This is what the default is for all users. So back to the remote access. So I'm in the routing remote access console and the remote access server at this point. So if I right click on remote access logging policies, there's an option to launch the MPS. So I can open up the policy service. And there's network policies. And by default, I believe that this is set to deny and policies enabled. So this is what you'll see when you open up your console. So there's connections to other access servers, the day and time restriction, and it's set to deny. And there's this connection to Microsoft Routing Remote Access Server with an MS/RRAS vendor ID. This allows connections from any Windows machine. And that's why it's in the processing order of almost 1 million. So it's going to be at the end of the list. So as you add policies to this list, this always ends up on the bottom. And it's just like an access control list for Cisco. It goes through until there's a match. And once there's a match, it uses that policy. And whatever's in the policy, whether it's deny, so this one matches all Windows machines, it's enabled, and it denies all Windows machines. So if I go in here and I just click grant for this policy that matches all Microsoft Windows clients, and if the user has the proper username and password and the policy is set to grant access to remote access policy, that should be it. That's all we need to do. Go Go under here, enable this policy. Or set it to grant, I should say. Not, it was enabled, set it to grant access. So go back to the Windows 7 machine, and I'll try to connect one more time. Connect, and it works. Okay, so that's a working setup for your remote access server. VPN using PPTP. Thanks. If I go back to the remote access server over here, and I look at remote access clients, I can see that there's one remote access client connected. And if I look at the ports, I can see one active port and it's PPTP. So I'm using one. All of these ports are other. Each connection to the VPN takes one port. So I can only have as many connections as I have ports available. If I select the properties here for ports, I can see that there's 128 ports for each of these different VPN technologies, whether I'm using PPTP or L2TP or SSTP. It depends which one I'm connecting with. And so I allow access inbound. There's also demand dial for VPN to VPN connections, and you can change the maximum port number. So if you only have a limited number of connections that you want to use, you could lower that number. Okay. I'm going to go back in here. I'll change these, all of them, just for fun. And you can see the list gets much shorter. So I have 5 for IKE, 5 L2TP, the 1 PPPoE, PPTP, and SSTP. And I still have the 1 active connection even though I changed the number of ports available. And I can disconnect this guy right from here. Back and refresh this, see if he's actually disconnected. And he is. I go back over to the Windows 7 machine, it's disconnected. Okay, so that's a basic setup for a VPN. In your book, there's one other thing that it mentions, and that's split tunneling. If you go under Options here, and you take a look at the networking and TCP/IP properties, you can actually, there's an option here for use default gateway on remote network. So when I connect through the VPN, so normally I'm at home or wherever and I connect to the internet. Once the VPN's connected to this remote access server, those settings mean that I have to go through the VPN and then back out through the company network using that default gateway for all internet access. That's fine because you might have some security settings to protect the network connection for your employees. When they're away, you want them to surf the internet through this connection. But in a less secure environment where you actually want to have the connection used to connect to the internal, and you still want to allow the user to surf the internet using their own default gateway, that's called a split tunnel. And you can just remove this checkbox, and if you do, then they'll use their own default gateway even though they're connected to the VPN. That's all a split tunnel is. So you can still connect to the VPN, but now even though I have the VPN connection, when I open a browser, it will use my own internet connection. It's waiting. There we go. So it brings up my browser and it works. Alright, so that's all there is to a basic PPTP VPN configuration. Thanks.